Welcome everyone. Today we're exploring attitudes in organizational settings. Attitudes are relatively stable evaluations that individuals hold toward objects, people, or events in their environment. They function as psychological filters through which employees perceive their workplace, significantly influencing behavior and decisions. Unlike personality traits, which remain relatively stable, attitudes can be modified through various organizational interventions, making them particularly important for managers to understand when cultivating productive work environments. Attitudes are essentially evaluative judgments that serve as cognitive shortcuts in complex social environments. They exist on a continuum ranging from strongly positive to strongly negative, with neutral attitudes in the middle. Attitudes can be explicit, where we're consciously aware of them, or implicit, operating below conscious awareness yet still influencing behavior. Their relative malleability compared to personality traits makes them particularly relevant for organizational change processes. The Tricomponent, or ABC model suggests that attitudes consist of three interconnected elements. The cognitive component encompasses our beliefs and thoughts about the attitude object. The affective component includes feelings and emotions evoked by the object. The behavioral component refers to our intention to act in certain ways toward the object. These components interact but don't always align perfectly. For example, an employee might recognize the value of new technology, cognitive, feel anxious about learning it, affective, yet still attempt to master it due to organizational expectations, behavioral. The cognitive component comprises our beliefs and mental frameworks about attitude objects. In organizations, this might include an employee's assessment of company policies, perceptions of leadership competence, or understanding of their role's contribution. These cognitions form schemas that help interpret experiences and are often the most accessible part of an attitude. The cognitive component is typically most influenced by rational arguments and information, making it a common target for organizational communication strategies. The affective component represents emotions generated by the attitude object, ranging from mild preference to strong passion or aversion. In workplace settings, this might include enthusiasm about projects, anxiety regarding restructuring, or pride in company achievements. Research suggests affective reactions often occur automatically and can be more resistant to change than cognitive elements. This explains why employees might intellectually understand organizational changes but still experience negative emotional responses that hinder acceptance. The behavioral component represents our predisposition to respond in certain ways toward the attitude object. In organizations, this might include intentions to apply for promotion, support a colleague's proposal, or consider resignation. While behaviors often align with cognitive and affective components, situational constraints frequently prevent direct expression. This distinction helps explain why attitudes don't always perfectly predict workplace behaviors, particularly in environments with strong situational pressures or constraints. Direct personal experience with attitude objects creates the strongest attitudes. These first-hand experiences generate attitudes that are more accessible for memory, show greater temporal stability, and better predict future behavior. Research shows attitudes based on direct experience are up to twice as predictive of subsequent behavior compared to those formed indirectly. This explains why experiential learning approaches like job rotations often produce more lasting attitude change than simply providing information through presentations or memos. Many attitudes form through observing others, particularly people we respect or identify with. In organizations, peer pressure and workplace socialization powerfully shape attitudes about work practices, policies, and leadership. Studies show newcomers rapidly adopt the attitudinal norms of their work groups, often within weeks of joining. This highlights the importance of positive role modeling by managers and organizational leaders, as their demonstrated attitudes significantly influence team members. Classical conditioning occurs when a neutral stimulus is repeatedly paired with another stimulus that naturally evokes an emotional response. In workplaces, this explains why employees develop emotional reactions to environmental elements consistently paired with pleasant or unpleasant experiences. For example, notification sounds that frequently signal problems may eventually trigger stress responses even outside work. These conditioned emotional responses often operate unconsciously, but significantly influence workplace attitudes. Attitudes are shaped through reinforcement, with rewarded perspectives strengthening while punished ones weaken. Organizational reward systems, both formal compensation and informal recognition, powerfully influence employee attitudes. If expressing innovative ideas consistently receives positive feedback, employees develop favorable attitudes toward creativity. Research shows organizational behavior modification through systematic reinforcement can improve performance by an average of 17%, highlighting how reinforcement shapes not just behaviors, but underlying attitudes. Observational learning occurs as employees absorb attitudes from influential organizational figures. During uncertainty or change, employees closely observe how executives, managers, and respected colleagues approach situations. Symbolic learning also happens through company communications and industry media. Research on vicarious reinforcement shows we learn by observing consequences others experience. This explains why mentors significantly impact professional attitude development, providing both explicit guidance and implicit modeling of values and approaches. Humans generally strive for consistency among thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, finding contradictions uncomfortable. This need for psychological harmony influences how we process information and interpret experiences. When inconsistencies arise, such as enjoying colleagues but disliking tasks, people typically adjust elements to achieve greater balance. This tendency creates resistance to contradictory information and helps explain why established workplace attitudes often prove difficult to change without addressing multiple attitude components simultaneously. Cognitive dissonance occurs when we experience conflicting thoughts or when actions contradict beliefs, creating psychological discomfort that motivates attitude change. Employees might experience dissonance when implementing policies they disagree with or working for companies whose values differ from personal ethics. To reduce dissonance, people typically change beliefs, add new justifications, or minimize the inconsistency. Research shows that when people perform actions inconsistent with attitudes, they often adjust attitudes to justify their behavior rather than acknowledge the contradiction. Self-perception theory suggests we often infer our attitudes by observing our own behavior, particularly when internal cues are ambiguous. When asked about job satisfaction, employees might reflect on their recent behaviors, working late, speaking positively about projects, and infer attitudes from these observations. This explains how role-playing affects attitude change. People assigned roles often develop attitudes consistent with those roles. This mechanism underlies compliance techniques where small commitments lead to larger ones as people infer favorable attitudes from initial behaviors. The elaboration likelihood model explains attitude formation through two processing routes. The central route involves thoughtful consideration of arguments, while the peripheral route relies on superficial cues like source credibility or presentation quality. Attitudes formed through central processing tend to be stronger and more resistant to counterarguments. This has significant implications for organizational communication strategies, helping determine when to focus on substantive evidence versus contextual factors when attempting to influence employee attitudes. Multiple factors shape organizational attitudes. Personal experiences provide interpretive frameworks for workplace events. Social group memberships and generational identities offer normative guidelines. Organizational culture creates powerful contextual influences that can override individual predispositions. Personality traits affect receptiveness to different information types. Economic and status considerations pragmatically influence attitudes toward practices that enhance position or compensation. Understanding these multifaceted influences helps managers recognize why employees form different attitudes toward identical organizational elements. Organizations commonly use surveys, questionnaires, and interviews to assess attitudes. While convenient for collecting data from large samples, these self-report measures are vulnerable to social desirability bias, with respondents presenting themselves favorably rather than reporting true attitudes. Research indicates questions about sensitive topics can show response distortion rates between 30 to 70%. Best practices include ensuring anonymity, using validated scales, and complementing self-reports with behavioral measures. Behavioral observation involves systematically monitoring actions that indicate underlying attitudes, including participation in initiatives, communication styles, and colleague interactions. Quantifiable metrics like attendance, performance data, and turnover often reflect attitudinal states. Linguistic analysis can detect attitudes with surprising accuracy based on word choice patterns. While avoiding social desirability bias, observational methods require trained observers and raise potential privacy concerns. Implicit measures detect unconscious evaluations that might not surface in self-reports. Techniques include reaction time tests measuring how quickly people associate concepts, projective techniques using ambiguous stimuli, and physiological indicators like skin response or pupil dilation. Research shows implicit and explicit measures often correlate weakly, R equals 0.24, suggesting they tap different attitude aspects. These measures reveal attitudes employees may not recognize or willingly report, providing deeper insights into workplace dynamics. Attitudes vary in their impact based on several strength dimensions. Importance reflects how much the individual personally cares about the attitude object. Knowledge base affects resilience, with information-rich attitudes proving more durable. Accessibility, how quickly attitudes come to mind, influences behavioral impact, with rapidly accessible attitudes better predicting spontaneous behaviors. Certainty in evaluations creates stronger attitudes, less susceptible to persuasion. Direct experience generates stronger attitudes than indirect formation. Understanding these dimensions helps organizations identify which attitudes most strongly influence workplace behavior. Attitudes significantly impact organizational effectiveness by influencing performance, citizenship behaviors, and counterproductive actions. Research shows job satisfaction correlates meaningfully with performance, R equals 0.30, representing substantial organizational impact across an entire workforce. Attitudes help explain why employees engage differently with similar environments and determine whether they embrace or resist organizational changes. Team dynamics depend heavily on interpersonal attitudes, with mutual respect enabling effective collaboration. Leadership effectiveness largely stems from the ability to shape employee attitudes toward organizational mission and initiatives. In conclusion, attitudes in organizations comprise cognitive, affective, and behavioral components formed through multiple psychological mechanisms, including direct experience, social learning, conditioning processes, and cognitive consistency seeking. Organizations measure attitudes through self-reports, behavioral observation, and implicit techniques, each offering unique insights. Attitudes vary in strength across dimensions of importance, knowledge base, accessibility, certainty, and experiential foundation. These attitudes profoundly influence organizational behavior, determining employee performance, satisfaction, change receptivity, team functioning, and leadership effectiveness. By understanding the complex nature of attitudes, managers gain valuable leverage points for creating more effective, engaged, and adaptable organizations.